Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined by Professor Robyn Faith Walsh from University of Miami, who has a Ph.D. from Brown University in Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean, with a focus on early Christianity, ancient Judaism, and Roman archaeology. So this is like
all
we got it all there, yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is I'm really happy to do this. We did a video before, but it was pre-recorded, but I wanted to have you on to engage with some people in the audience as well. And before we even get to that, I just want to throw that out there. There's a website in the description. She has her own website, and also in there is links for the books. And it's honestly one of my, this is it right here. This is honestly one of my favorite books that I've read in a while, because it's just goes so deep into the early Christian ideas and some of the zeitgeist stuff that's happening in that time period. So it really is like a must read, in my opinion. So I totally recommend it. And links are in the description for the book as well as the website. Go and check it out, and or get it for somebody else who might be interested. So with that being said, I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. I don't know why it's not going away, but hopefully, you have headphones on, so it shouldn't be. I don't know. Yeah. So we'll just keep going. Wait, is it gone? Oh, it's gone. It's a miracle. It was just went on for a couple seconds. That was weird. I couldn't hear myself think because it was so. But yeah.
I hate when that happens.
Yeah. Anyway, it's gone now, so we're good. So yeah, I want to just let the audience know. We'll keep it to Christianity, early Christianity, and try not to like go off in like political stuff. Let's stay focused on the topic at hand, which is early Christianity and the influences, ancient Mediterranean stuff like that. And obviously, you're not the all-knowing, like some things you might not have the answer to, and that's just how it is. So just want to let people know that. So, but I'm sure we're going to have some good questions. But anyways, there's one right off the bat from Mary Smith. Thank you for your super chat. She says, do you think the early Christian movement was Platonist or Jewish?
That's a great question. So it's really, and I don't mean this to sound like a dodge, it is somewhere in between, meaning to the extent that we reconstruct the early Christian movement based on the text, what we have are Paul's letters. Those are our earliest pieces of evidence. And then we have the canonical gospels, which is not to say that the canonical gospels are even the earliest that were written, right? They're just what survives. I want to make a distinction between what still survives and what might have also been there, right? So there might have been, we know hundreds of other gospels. We do have some of them that were written in the first, say, 2 centuries of what we call the Common Era. But the 4 gospels, and especially the Synoptic gospels, are the ones that have ended up being the source for us to reconstruct the early Christian movement. What we get from those texts, especially from Paul, and Paul may have been an influence on those gospel authors. I think that that's actually pretty conclusive. Scholarship is continuing to debate that issue. But Paul himself is a Pharisee, so he's Jewish. He's an interpreter of the Jewish law. He's very, very well versed in the Septuagint version of the Torah. And many of his letters go through different kinds of explanations, right? I'm thinking Galatians is the one that always comes to mind, where he uses the story of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, to explain, almost like an analogy, to explain his understanding of how Gentiles can join in Christ. So he's very, very well aware of those texts, cites them all the time. But so that makes it very Jewish. And certainly in the Gospels, you have references to Jewish scripture as well. Matthew is the one that often comes to mind. Wherever he says it is written, it is usually followed by a quote from the Hebrew Bible. But at the same time, the way that they construct the world, especially Paul, in terms of, let's call it its materialistic elements, meaning, and elements is kind of a funny word for me to go to, actually, in that description, meaning the actual way that the world is made up. How is it functioning? Sure. They tend to default to certain Platonic and Stoic thinking. And default, I only use that word because really in the first century, these are the 2 predominant philosophical movements in the Roman era. It's what people would have been educated on when they went to school. So if you're writing, you've been educated. So you know these texts very well. But it's also how the world, everyone tends to view how the world is constructed both ethically and materially. So especially with Stoicism, We often call this period Middle Platonism, meaning that you have Platonic influence, but Platonism only gives you sort of the ethics, right? It's a dialogue, the Platonic texts that survive, right? It doesn't give you all the information. Stoicism, as another philosophical movement, emerges about 300 years before the Common Era, but it's very popular in the first century, and it's very focused on what we would call physics or materialism. How does the world work? When that gets fused in with the Platonism as kind of an explanation, a filler for the things that are not answered by the ethical strategies of Platonism, we call that Middle Platonism. So Stoic physics combined with Platonic ethics. And
Wow,
Paul,
I never knew that.
yeah, so that's why it's Platonist, but it's Middle Platonist because it has some Stoicism. But the Stoicism is what really stands out in the letters of Paul. So whenever you see the word spirit, for example, in an English translation of the New Testament, the word in Greek is pneuma. We usually say pneuma. And that word was a technical term in Stoicism. And it was a material substance. It was just considered so super refined you couldn't see it with the naked eye. And so the way that the spirit works, that it interpenetrates people, mixes with their physical bodies, changes their constitution, forces them to act ethically, at least ideally. That whole idea, again, it's the ethics and the materialism combined in Middle Platonism as a strategy for explaining, how does the world work? How do human beings work? Kind of like an ontology, right?
Yeah.
So that we see in Paul very, very distinctly. And remember, he's talking to Gentiles too, who would have also probably been well aware, if not reading themselves, because we know literacy was limited in antiquity. At least they're aware of these Platonic ideas, Stoic ideas. We have examples. There's a scholar named Elizabeth Rawson, who sadly passed away a while ago, but wrote a lot about this. There are illiterate Stoics, quote unquote, rustic Stoics, they're called in the literature. Like, these are people who are not formally educated, but call themselves Stoics, who would just kind of walk around the town square and, give you their ideas. So we know that Platonism, Stoicism, they're operational as theories for how the world works. Paul knows them. He deploys them as part of his strategy, coupled with Jewish texts. And then it seems as though Mark picks that up. And then whether or not Matthew, Luke, probably Luke for sure, are actually reading the letters of Paul. At the very least, we know Matthew and Luke are reading Mark, right? So in that mix, again, those texts that have survived for us, that become sort of the centerpiece of how we make these evaluations. We see both Platonism and Judaism.
And it's such a fascinating time because it's like you have these two schools of thought: the Platonists, who think that there's these forms, then there's the Epicureans that think it's atoms and void.
And you have the Cynics who are like living on the street and acting weird.
Diogenes living in a can. But and then all of a sudden, I never thought about middle. I always thought, because it was like the order, Platonism, middle, and then in the middle, and then Neo.
It's like stages, but it's middle because basically Platonism was super, super popular. I'm going to name drop a few scholars here in case people want to read, further reading.
That's what.
And just so you know, where I'm structuring a lot of this stuff from. There's a scholar named Maren Niehoff who I really like. She writes about Philo quite a bit. And she notes that by the time of Josephus, so late first century, no one's doing Platonism anymore. It's it's unpopular. It's not like the intellectual fad. It's all Stoicism at that point, right? So it's that little space in time, really first century BCE to first century CE. You start to see, especially late Republic, Stoicism starts to make more inroads. Platonism's still super popular, but you still see Stoicism being cited quite a bit. We tend to associate people who have pre-knowledge of this Stoicism with people like Marcus Aurelius, right? Or Cicero. So we think late Republic Cicero to Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism is it rules the day. But in that stage, like you're saying, it's sort of a progression. You have Platonism super popular, Stoicism starts to make these inroads, that becomes Middle Platonism, and we judge that both because of the time period, but because you could see the features, right? And again, we know from Platonism, it's actually ironic that we have a letter writer in Paul who uses the dialogues of Plato in part. He uses, it seems pretty clear. There's a scholar, Emma Wasserman, who writes about this. Paul seems to know the Republic really well, Plato's Republic. And I've looked at this in my classes and sometimes had my students read Republic 9 or the Phaedrus. he seems to be aware of those too, which is, that he's using a dialogue and we get one side of his dialogue. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of funny, but you fill in those blanks. He does. And then a lot of these philosophers in this period fill in those blanks with stoicism of like, it's good to know like about the forms. It's great to know like how to act ethically, but practically speaking, scientifically, like how does this work? And stoicism steps up to the plate.
Wow, that made a lot of sense. I just learned a lot just from that one answer. So thank you for that question, Mary. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mary.
And Derek from Myth Vision Podcast is in the house with the question. This may be clipped for his channel, so no, I'm just kidding. But it might be. Dr. Walsh, do you think there was a communities behind the Gospels, including non-canon, even if the German Romanticism method is not correct?
So I think that there's somebody in some kind of group, right, behind these texts, meaning it doesn't make a lot of sense for any of these authors, canonical or non-canonical, to be motivated to write a story about Jesus, about Christ, about his teachings, if they're not aware of what we would call Christianity or some kind of community. Now, I don't want to get too in the weeds. There are a couple of things to unpack about this. When it comes to community, the problem with the word community is we in English put all kinds of weight on that word. When we say community, we think of a group that's like self-evidently bounded, that like recognizes it's in a community, that it's already well established institutionally. We have all kinds of understandings of how that word functions that I think don't necessarily map on sociologically to what the formation of early Christianity in its earliest stages probably look like. You probably had people coming in and out of the movement to some extent. The word ecclesia, where we get church, actually meant assembly in antiquity. And John Kloppenborg has written a great book called Christ Assemblies about this, where people, might have multiple affiliations. They might go to what we would call a church, but they probably, like, if you wanted a hamburger, you had to sacrifice meat, like Paul talks about this problem, right? Like sacrificing to idols. Like some people couldn't give up In-N-Out, so they still like were going to like the sacrifice of animals to get their like their keto diet, and so then they would like go back to the assembly. We might look at that and say like, well, this person is like in a church, but they're also worshiping ISIS. Like what, right? Like I'm being kind of fast and loose here, but you understand what?
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of the cohesive community, and this is the only thing that these people care about. That these are, this is the only group that the gospel, say, author or any author is writing for, and that it has a singular center, purpose, focus. That's the thing that I want to trouble a little bit. So I often talk in terms of spheres. Whoever's writing these gospels, or canonical or non-canonical, is probably part of multiple different kinds of what we might consider communities or groups or assemblies, a Christ assembly. Maybe they're still going to another kind of, if they're a Gentile, another kind of worship group. Maybe they have like in their domestic space, like still have an icon to like the lares, or they like in the ancient alarm system used to be like Jupiter of the hearth, right? Like, so maybe they're still making sure that they have like an altar in their home to like whatever patron deity that they want to have associated with domestic space. And then certainly whoever's writing these texts, even patronizing a person to write these texts, is probably associated with other writers, right? They're reading things, consuming other kinds of literature that informs what they put into their own gospels. And most writers want to see their work spread broadly, not written by and for communities of a very singular nature. So I think that, there probably were Christians, or what we might call Christ groups, behind the Gospels to some extent, but that German romantic idea of, like they're all just like these Christians huddled, hiding, from persecution, choosing their one literate spokesperson to write the gospel down for them because they're, holding on to an oral tradition that goes back multiple generations. That to me is the romantic reconstruction of these communities that I don't think bears up to, sociological scrutiny.
Wow, that makes that's a great question, and then that made a lot of sense. Thank you for that, Derek. And go and subscribe to the Vision Podcast. And by the way, there's a course coming up. I might as well throw that out there. You guys just filmed a course about this subject, so be on the lookout for that. I'm definitely gonna be getting mine. So keep on the lookout for that. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Derek.
Camille Gregor, thanks for the super chat. Is there evidence that Kloppenborg's associations function as the kind of literary circles you're describing?
Oh, cataloging kind of the miracle stories. So the thing that only throws me off with this question a little bit is Kloppenborg's associations. I don't know if he means like the Christ associations or the way that Kloppenborg describes associations. So I'll kind of answer with both of those contexts in mind. What Kloppenborg looks at in that book primarily are inscriptions, right? Trying to reconstruct a couple of things, not only the membership roles of associations, but how these people, like what sociological level they might have been at, or stratum they might have been at, what they were like, what were they purchasing, what were those family units like, and a little bit about the family line of many of the people associated with these assemblies. I'm not sure that he really bears down into the question of were these groups producing texts, or nor am I sure that we know that in terms of just an assembly doing this or an association doing this on their own. Usually ecclesia were things like, and again, I'll be a little fast and loose with the analogy here, but in antiquity, you didn't really have like public works programs the same way we do now, or like they're professional associations that aren't part of necessarily like state-run organization, meaning you kind of need an assembly of the fire department, right? These assemblies, they're almost like unions, maybe is even a better analogy. Like if you're part of an ecclesia of like the bakers, right? Like when you pay your dues, you have a dinner, your family's all a part of it. Like you try to induct, like, it's a patriarchal society. So like if you're a member of it, you try to induct your son into it if he goes into the profession. And if somebody dies, like you have the funds to pull together to like bury the person, right? Or if somebody is sick, you can help them have like, what would we call it? Like, like injury pay or something like that, right? Like you help keep everybody afloat. That these groups would be writing literature, that's really what I call cultural elite who do that. So cultural elite meaning you didn't have to necessarily be like a super rich guy to be literate, but because you could be, and this is the work of Candida Moss, you could be an enslaved person and be literate, but be enslaved by someone who needs your literacy within the household to, record things, send letters, write things down, right? So you could be culturally elite, meaning you have the education, the literacy to engage in literate culture. But that was really the purview of the elite, whether because of institutional structure or because of wealth. And so usually what you see are people on the wealthier side of things having not only the capacity to write stuff because they have like actual practical access to like papyri and ink, but it's also the Romans talked about this word, which is analogous in English, a luxuria. It was like a luxury to be educated in antiquity, and to a certain extent. Again, I'm not talking about people who are enslaved and this is against their will. Again, see the work of Candida Moss on this. But just generally speaking, to be well educated enough to write prose literature, even at the level of the gospel writers, you had to have a fair amount of schooling. Schooling was not legally demanded in the ancient world. You didn't have to go to school. Like I have to start sending my son to kindergarten, and like we went to the meeting and I was whispering to my husband, like, we're on the grid because like they start, like he has to be there at 9 and like he's got to be there all day, right? Like we mandate education in a certain way. That wasn't the case in antiquity. You usually just went to school long enough to be basically educated in whatever skill you needed. And then you moved on and you went to work. I was actually watching a documentary about Arthur Miller the other day, and like his father went to school for 6 months. That was it, in the early 20th century, because he needed to work. And the family lived in like a tenement apartment with 2 rooms, and they were sewing suit coats, and he needed to go to work. So they could afford to send him to school for about 6 months. And that was it. And then he had to go to work. And so he was functionally illiterate until he got married. His wife taught him how to read and sign his name. And then they gave birth to Arthur Miller, who became like a great playwright of the 20th century, right?
Wow.
But, so I give that analogy to say, like, you had to luxuriate to be able to learn enough to read and write. So the idea that an association, I mean, I guess you could say perhaps an association would indeed find somebody to record something down on their behalf, but usually it would be more of a patron-client relationship. And also that isn't typically what, at least from Kloppenborg's book, and I'd want to review it again, but because I read it last year. Oh, yep, it's a great book.
I'm going to interview him, by the way.
He's a wonderful scholar.
Yeah.
But he was really just trying to trace, kind of the sociological aspects, right, of what these associations do. Because I know one of my big takeaways from his book, and I had a chance to be in a conference with him last summer, and I asked him this to just like make sure I understood this right. But we don't have any documentary evidence of like a senatorial patronage of any kind of an association or assembly before very, very late in the Roman Empire. So these assemblies, especially these Christ assemblies, are kind of like a lower tier. If we're going to talk about economics, a lower tier, at least in terms of who's participating in them and who's sponsoring them. You don't have really elite patronage for a while for these kinds of associations.
Thank you for that question. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that sometimes I do this myself. I fantasize the ancient world as like, oh, they had these beautiful Corinthian columns everywhere and everybody was dressed in robes and everyone's like, no, people were poor and it was hard to live back then.
And you had to work. Yeah. And I don't know that we had any like literary assemblies, right? Like,
right.
If that's also another way you could read that question, Cicero, talks about his friends that he writes to. And obviously, like, we're not talking at the level of a Cicero for the reasons I just discussed. But, Cicero would like send a letter to his brother and to like a few other like rich dudes, to like proofread something he wrote. And they would like circulate and discuss. And like they'd say to him, maybe you shouldn't use this guy's name. Maybe you should do this instead. And he called them his amici, or so, like he would call them his friends, right? Yeah. And so it was more, those literary networks were less formal in the sense of they might not be an ecclesia, at least as far as my knowledge goes.
Yeah, and real quick, just before I go to the next one, Kloppenborg's book is so deep into this topic that I cannot stress how much I learned from this.
Same.
And he does talk about it being like unions, like you mentioned. Like these are groups of people who stick together in a certain trade. Sometimes they're like coppers or coppersmiths or whatever. But like they were called ecclesia, and they would bury their dead in these tombs, and oftentimes they would share it with the Orphics or something. So yeah, it's a very interesting.
We see that in the catacombs too, right? Like, and some of this again is the nature of the evidence. Like, of course, we're looking at like burials because that's what we still have, right? So, there's a scholar, Heather Cox Richardson, that always says like time and temperatures are approximate. So I'll use that caution too. Like there might be some other evidence that comes up that would change some of the nuance of what I'm saying here. But yeah, union in many ways becomes a very good analogy, at least for modern thinking about this, in part because of exactly that, what we see in, say, the catacombs or in other burials. Actually, an example that I'll give that is kind of a guild, but it is a little strange, but you've probably even heard of in the news, is gladiators. Like you always hear that they like clunked into another gladiator burial ground, like, when they're trying to make a car park in the UK somewhere or something, right? Like you hear, and, everyone always loves that because you always find like some skull with like a trident, like, hole in it. And cool. no disrespect to the guy who got stabbed in the head with a trident, but you know what I mean? Like people find gladiators interesting. Thank you, Ridley Scott, for that movie. But the fact that like all the gladiators are like in a burial spot together, right? Like for all we know, there's an ecclesia of the gladiators. But this idea that, people go into guilds and help each other. Writing itself was not particularly a guild in the same way. It tended to be a little bit more diffuse just because of, I think, again, that stratum of society that had the luxury, the capability, the access to exchange texts.
Fascinating. And I am going to see John Kloppenborg in person with a Cinema 6K camera. That's going to be coming next month. Also, Tony Burke's going to be there too. So I just want to tell the guys out there, stay tuned for that one.
Tell them I said hi.
I definitely will.